Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, and I'm your host, Rachel Leroy. This is Season 3, Episode 13, and the episode today is going to be Rethinking Our Thoughts, Part 1, What are Cognitive Distortions and How Can I Overcome Them? That's Season 3, Episode 13, Rethinking Our Thoughts, Part 1, What are Cognitive Distortions and How Can I Overcome Them? So this is the first part in a two-part series on rethinking our thoughts. Now, primarily on this podcast, we focus on somatic and body-based therapies for healing trauma and for healing difficult emotions. But it's also important to deal with trauma and emotions and thoughts when it comes to the mind. If you take a holistic approach, mind and body and spirit, you're going to heal the most. So that's why we're going to do one on rethinking our thoughts, because our thoughts are still very important. And so the first part is cognitive distortions, and the next episode will be rethinking our thoughts, part 2. Rethinking our thoughts, part 2. What is learned helplessness and how can I overcome it? So that will be the next one. That's part 2, and that's Rethinking Our Thoughts, part 2. What is learned helplessness and how can I overcome it? So we'll cover that for the next part of this series next time in a 2-part series on Rethinking Our Thoughts. So let's go ahead and jump into Rethinking Our Thoughts, part 1, the cognitive distortions, and we'll get to that in just a second. First, if you haven't, check out the YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the show notes, and the YouTube channel has material exclusive to the YouTube channel. You can't get it anywhere else. Go to the link, click the red subscribe bell, and you will get a notification for every time a new YouTube video comes out. The videos come out every 2 weeks when I'm in season. Sometimes I take a break, but overall they do come out every 2 weeks. There's a little bit of overlap between the podcast and the YouTube video, but not a lot. Most of the material is more specialized, and it's exclusive to the YouTube channel. Also, if you would like to help this podcast, if you would like to help me to continue to work in this ministry, as I've stated, if you know me, you know that I also work. So, and I deal with chronic health issues. So it can be a challenge to keep the podcast going, to keep the platform going, to support people in the Facebook group and the YouTube channel and the podcast, and all of those are free. I do want to expand on a store and eventually maybe have a membership site to help fund the podcast and to help me to continue to be able to do this work. Of course, like you, I have to pay bills. And also there are expenses involved in running the podcast and the website and all of those things. And so if you make a donation, you're helping me. By the way, if you have made a donation, or if you're doing a Patreon monthly support, thank you so much. I have some people that are doing that, and I greatly appreciate it. But keep in mind that if you're doing donating, whether you do a one-time donation. If you want to do a one-time donation, you can go to Ko-Fi, KOFI.com. I'll put the link in the show notes. And if you want to donate monthly, you can do $5, $10, or $25 a month. And that is greatly appreciated as well. And that is even more helpful. And you can go to Patreon to do that. And I'll put a link to Patreon as well. Both are reputable and well-respected sites. Thank you so much for those that are donating, like I said. And lastly, if you want to get community support and monthly, weekly memes, as I call them, to inspire you, check out the Instagram and or the Facebook page. The Facebook page is where you can connect with other people in the community like you. Those are all free. Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and jump in to rethinking our thoughts. What are cognitive distortions and how can you overcome them? So the first thing that you might be asking is, what is a cognitive distortion and what has that got to do with this channel? What has this got to do with healing emotions, healing childhood trauma, emotional neglect, narcissistic abuse, regular traumas that happen every day? Not that traumas are regular, but you know what I mean. What is cognitive distortions and how can rethinking those help you to heal your trauma on a holistic level from your thoughts? So we'll talk about that today. So what we're going to talk about is, what are cognitive distortions? How do they relate to and impact trauma, and vice versa? How does trauma relate to and impact those? And after talking about the concept of cognitive distortions, we'll talk about how that can create a cycle of re-traumatization and how to break that and stop that cycle in its tracks. And then we'll go through the cognitive distortions. There are 10. Now, this isn't set in stone. There could be others, and there are some people that make lists that don't include all these 10, but I'm basing mine on Feeling Good by Burns. And that is a book that I will put in the show notes as a source that really helped me. It's a book called Feeling Good by Burns. It sounds kind of kooky because, like I said, this isn't like pop psychology. I don't do a lot of that about self-esteem and feeling good about yourself. I think there's something to that, but I spent years in those camps and they did not heal me. We get right to the root of the trauma and we talk about how to think about yourself in terms of healing. And so while your whole identity is not wrapped up into that, there is something, the Feeling Good book isn't just about, oh, I'm feeling good. It's about working on these cognitive distortions. And I actually did a lot of this work when I was seeing a therapist in the past, a certain one that I saw, and it really did help me a lot. It made me more aware of my thoughts so that I could shift them, and it does make you feel better because the system behind this is actually quantifiable, which means you can count and take surveys of yourself to see how you're feeling based on these cognitive distortions. And as you start to cut down on them, the difficult emotions that you might deal with actually go down in proportion to that. So there's actually science behind this. So let's look a little bit in the cognitive distortions. So most of what we describe on this channel involves, like I said, healing trauma in the body from the original experience, from the original trauma, whether that is some form of emotional, physical, mental, psychological, sexual, or spiritual abuse, or some kind of traumatic event or series of traumatic events that were events, so to speak. But our understanding of our thoughts, how they work and how they are related to trauma is also an important part of the healing work. And I've wanted to talk about cognitive distortions for a while because I think they are important. And in the past, they did have an impact on me. And I think anything that can help, I want to make you aware of it on this channel because what works for one person may work even better for somebody else. And so that's why we're covering this. And also, like I said, to take that holistic approach and to educate you and empower you on these different systems so you can find what works for you. So, cognitive distortions and healing those is still a mode of healing worth exploring, particularly in daily life. You can't possibly observe and change all your thoughts all the time. That would actually drive you crazy, right? And I believe in getting to the root underneath them more, but you still need to be aware of your thoughts and you can target your thoughts and that can help you heal. So by by being the objective observer of your thoughts and feelings and then making changes based on these, we can start altering some of our thought patterns and feeling better. And also, thoughts and emotions and trauma cannot be completely disconnected. So if you hit this from multiple sides, you're going to be more thorough in cleaning up that garbage that's in your mind and in your body, that trauma that you want to release through your neural network and heal. Okay? So if you juxtapose or put next to each other cognitive work with body work, mind work with body work, or cognitive and somatic, mind, body, it can be a powerful combination because one informs and influences the other. So that is one reason why we're doing this particular topic today. Also, I've got some sources here, as I always do, and as always, I credit the sources. And there's an article in the Very Well Mind. There's an article in Very Well Mind. I love their articles. They're simple, they're straightforward, they're easy to understand. This is a reputable site, and I use them a lot. But this article is called Cognitive Distortions and How Negative Thoughts Affect PTSD. So, how negative thoughts affect people with PTSD. And in the article, let's see, this is by Matthew Tull, PhD, and it's reviewed by Daniel Block, MD. But it says, you can better understand the definition of cognitive distortion by first acknowledging that we all have negative thoughts from time to time. So this article, the beginning, is giving you a definition of cognitive distortions, what they are, and how they impact you, especially if you have PTSD. This is especially the case for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In fact, negative thoughts are so common in certain mental health disorders that mental health professionals use the term cognitive distortions to describe them. Now, this is my idea. One thing I do want to note is that when you think of distortions, you're thinking of something that's warped and twisted like it's your fault. If you have warped and twisted thoughts, or if you have dark thoughts, but most likely if you just have cognitive distortions and you've had a lot of trauma in your life, or your ACEs score is high. ACEs is adverse childhood experiences. That's based on strong research. That's not your fault if you have a lot of cognitive distortions. Your mind is simply misprogrammed, and you can reprogram your mind. Lisa Romano talks about this a lot, and that's why the daily work is so important. And one thing that you can do to reprogram your mind is work on and understand cognitive distortions and work on flipping those and flipping the script and rethinking those. And so the Very Well Minds article says, also known as maladaptive thoughts, errors in thinking or irrational thoughts, cognitive distortions refer to unpleasant thoughts that are extreme, exaggerated, or not consistent with what is actually going on in the real world. So there's a connection to objective reality here. And if you have a lot of trauma, you're going to have a lot of distorted thoughts. And like I said, that's not your fault. It says, as a result, cognitive distortions can have a negative influence on our mood and eventually lead to unhealthy behaviors. The connection between thoughts and actions is part of the reason cognitive distortions are considered a central part of cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is my thoughts. I have said that cognitive behavioral therapy alone will not heal trauma. Now, can it help you heal trauma? Yes. Will it heal it at the root? I don't think it will. But can it contribute to healing it in conjunction with other more root-based treatments and strategies? Yes, absolutely. So it's worth exploring. So it says, for example, let's say you commonly have the thought, I will always be depressed. Whenever the thought pops in your head, you will likely start feeling sad, down, hopeless, and helpless. When you start thinking about being depressed, you may start to isolate yourself or avoid activities that you may enjoy. So it says, then this is then only going to increase the chances of your depression worsening and sticking around. This thought is a cognitive distortion. It is highly unlikely that you will always feel depressed. It's not accurate. There are still going to be many times when you feel better. In addition, looking at your past, chances are you haven't always been depressed. So while it may feel like you will always be depressed, in reality, your depression can come and go. So that's an example of a cognitive distortion and how it works. It's pretty straightforward, really. And so that is a little bit about what cognitive distortions are, how they impact your moods, how they relate to trauma, and how trauma relates to them. So cognitive distortions are basically inaccurate errors in thought that you can surmise and identify objectively. Okay. And we'll, like I said, we're actually going to go through each of the 10, talk about what they are, how they work. I might share some personal experience with these because I'll be honest, I've struggled a lot with negative thinking. And negative thinking and cognitive distortions, basically the same thing. And it's been something that's even affected my identity. I have suffered from a lot of self-hatred and a lot of just beating on myself because of my negative thinking, and it creates this vicious cycle. And I've learned to love myself, and I've learned to accept myself, and I've learned to be kind to myself and to love my inner child. And in that work, that's helped me to accept that, yes, maybe I do lean towards negative thinking, and maybe that's not my fault, but that's not who I am, So if you have these thoughts, that's not who you are, okay? And like I said, they come from places like where you had a chaotic background. If you tried to get help, or you cried when you were a child and you were told to shut up, or nobody came when you cried, then you're not going to believe that things are going to work out. And so that's going to distort your thoughts, your actual experiences. If you are around people that had a lot of cognitive distortions, you were going to pick up on that. That will be your programming, and that's not your fault either. It sucks. It's not fair, right? But that's what it is. And you can work on this. It can get better. You do have power there. And the more you're able to get a grip on those, the less helpless you'll feel. And that's why I thought that this connected well with this concept of learned helplessness. And we're going to talk about a solution to that called learned optimism. Not the same thing as positive thinking, not exactly. And I thought that those were very connected, the concept of cognitive distortions and then the concept of learned helplessness. And how does that happen in people? And what's the result of that? So we'll talk about that next week, or the next podcast, the second part of this episode, this series. Okay, so the concept of, like I said, cognitive distortions, it can be a cycle that starts with trauma. And sometimes it isn't even trauma. It can just be difficult situations, bad programming, and bad influences. And that creates a distortion or series of distortions. And then that creates more trauma in some cases and more difficult emotions and so on. So you get this cycle that starts, and then it just keeps on. It circles around, it circles around, it circles around. You think a thought, you feel a certain way. You feel a certain way, you think a thought. You see how that cycles around, and that creates or perpetuates or contributes to the cycle of trauma in a lot of cases. It doesn't even have to be trauma. Somebody can be caught up in a bunch of negative thoughts and it not even be trauma. So either way, this can help you heal, even if you haven't had a lot of trauma in your life. Everybody's had some, though, I would argue. So you can't possibly observe and change your thoughts all at the same time, but you can be objective and focus on one thought at a time. And that's where healing cognitive distortions comes in. And that's where breaking that cycle in its tracks can help and can stop, so that you can have enough time to slow that train of thought down and you don't keep re-traumatizing yourself. And then when you combine dealing with the thoughts with getting to it at the root while that cycle is stopped, that's what allows you to heal trauma from a holistic point of view, with thoughts and feelings in mind, in the body and in the mind. And that's where understanding, stopping, and changing our thoughts can stop the cycle of re-traumatization that cognitive distortions can cause. So very quickly, I wanted to read a Healthline article, not the whole article, but a couple of paragraphs. So where do cognitive distortions come from? Talked about that a little bit, and a little bit of the section in Healthline. And it's called, What are Cognitive Distortions and How Can You Change These Thinking Patterns? So it's more of a general article on cognitive distortions. What are cognitive distortions and how can you change these thinking patterns? And I'm not sure if there's an author to this one, but this is by Healthline. And I don't see a person listed as the article author. It says written by Rebecca Joy Stanborough, edited by Heather Hobbs, medically reviewed by Deborah Rose Wilson, with a lot of letters by her name, copy edited by Jamie Elmer. Okay, so this article talks about cognitive distortions involve negative thinking patterns that aren't based in fact or reality. So they are inaccurate. and you can help change these thinking patterns to promote your mental well-being. Examples of them are, I have the worst luck in the world. I just failed the math test. I'm no good at school. Might as well quit. This is the Healthline examples. She's late. It's raining. She has hydroplaned and her car's upside down in a ditch. Okay, shouldn't laugh, but it's kind of funny because I think we've all catastrophized it that way. And 99.9% of the time, the person's just being bird-brained, or they got a flat tire, or something very minor, These are all prime examples of cognitive distortions, thought patterns that can cause people to view reality in inaccurate, usually negative ways. In short, they're habitual errors in thinking, but when experiencing a cognitive distortion, the way you interpret events is usually negatively biased. So it's a negative bias. Most people experience cognitive distortions from time to time, so everybody has them, but they're reinforced. If they're reinforced often enough, they can increase anxiety, deepen depression, and cause relationship difficulties and lead to other complications. And that's where you get that snowball effect and that cycle I was talking about. So interrupting that cycle can make all the difference. Learn more about cognitive distortions, including their connections to mental health, the types, and what you can do to change your thoughts. So that's a little bit about cognitive distortions. And then it says, where do they come from? Cognitive distortions are types of thinking patterns that emphasize negative biases. Mental health professionals first described them in the late 70s and 1980s. Research from 2017 suggests that people may develop cognitive distortions to cope with adverse life events, adverse childhood experiences. Hello. The most prolonged and severe those adverse events are, the more they are, the more likely it is that one of or more cognitive distortions will form. So it's a pattern. It's not just a one-time thought, usually. It's a pattern. Human beings might even have developed cognitive distortions as an evolutionary survival method. In other words, experiencing stress could cause you to adapt your thinking in useful ways for immediate survival. But these thoughts often aren't rational or healthy long-term. Is thinking with cognitive distortions a mental illness? Research suggests that cognitive distortions may occur in a number of mental health conditions. These include depression, dysphoria, and anxiety disorders. However, cognitive distortions aren't considered a mental illness of their own. In the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5, that's the manual, right? Cognitive distortion is not listed as a mental health condition. That would be hard to do because it's not something that stays. You can actually get rid of it. Not that you can't heal certain mental health conditions, but it's something that is more conditioned. Does that make sense? Versus a brain-based actual change in your brain or your body chemistry. Experiencing occasional cognitive distortions is natural. However, experiencing them regularly could be a reason to see a mental health professional for help. Okay? So that is a little bit more about cognitive distortions. Let's go ahead and talk about, since you know a little bit about what cognitive distortions are, I also want you to see that it's scriptural to work on cognitive distortions. Because if you Google cognitive distortions and scripture and similar phrases, you get tons of stuff from a lot of reputable sites. And then there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of the cognitive distortions on the list are thoughts we're warned about in scripture to be aware of and to work on. Because the Bible always talks about our minds and our thoughts and what comes out of our mouth and how that has power, and even talks about how the Word of God has power, and those are also thoughts. So that's the root of everything, really. And so there's a list of scriptures that I found, and it was from openbible.info, and it just has thoughts in the mind. And then there's all these scriptures. So those might be some ones that you would want to look at to help you to, when you're studying this stuff. And there's all kinds of scriptures that back this concept of renewing your mind, of working on your thoughts, of being aware of dark and unhealthy thoughts and how those can take over your life and cause, it talks about destruction and all that. I know some of the language in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, can be a bit punitive. Here, I just want to talk about it in terms of how it can affect your life and your mind. And so how it can actually lead to, quote, destruction emotionally, but you can also be restored and healed by working on the trauma and working on the thoughts. One is that we all know Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may test and discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think on these things. So that is the healed part of the cognitive distortion when you change it. And it just goes on and on about thoughts and about how those thoughts can affect your life. Take every thought captive to obey Christ, 2 Corinthians 10:3-6. And there are ones that talk about how devious and manipulative and unhealthy people, you could argue narcissistic type people, how their thoughts are distorted and twisted and inaccurate and untrue. The Bible also says the truth will set you free. And accurate, objective reality is truth. Okay? So, they're not, truth and objectivity aren't exactly the same thing, but truth is something that's without bias, is something that's objective, is something that reflects reality. And there's a lot of scriptures here, and I'm not going to keep going through them, but there's just a lot about, for example, set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. So that's saying that if you work on those cognitive distortions, it implies that it actually is good for your health. And there's so much research behind that. But I won't, like I said, keep going through these. You can read these scriptures, but they just go on, and there's just so many that back this whole concept of working on and healing your cognitive distortions. So that's, scriptures on minding our thoughts, being aware of them. A lot of the cognitive distortions on the list, like I said, though, are things that are very similar to scripture and even the same in some cases. So let's go ahead and jump right into the list of 10 cognitive distortions. Now, like I said, that Feeling Good book by Burns, and then there's also Feeling Good Handbook by Burns. I have old copies of both of those that I went through a couple of times back in the day. This is old stuff, but it's established. It's been around for a while, and it works. And so I will put those in the show notes as potential resources. But let's talk about the 10 cognitive distortions that Burns came up with in his book and that are commonly accepted in the field as the main cognitive distortions. I found a Microsoft Word document, and I was trying to find who wrote this. It does copyright David Burns, MD, and it says, do not reproduce without permission. So I'm giving credit here. I'm not reproducing it or anything. I'm just reading it to you. So the 10 cognitive distortions are all or none thinking, overgeneralization, mental filter, discounting the facts, jumping to conclusions, magnification and minimization, emotional reasoning, should statements, labeling, and blame. So those are the 10 cognitive distortions. Now, I want to talk about each one and go through an example of each one and maybe share some personal experience so that you can see what the cognitive distortion is, give an example of it, and a positive distortion example. It's not distortion, but putting it back into an optimistic and accurate point of view. And so the thing about doing this work is that you become aware of the trigger, the thought. You identify what kind of distortion it is, or the closest thing that it is to it. You make yourself aware of what the thought is, and then you counter it with something that's more realistic and positive at the same time. It doesn't have to be puppies and rainbows and bubbles, but it needs to be something that's more aligned with objective reality and something that is hopeful and something that is positive. Yeah, that word, positive in some way, but it's not bypassing because you're acknowledging the negative thought. You're dealing with the negative thought. So you're countering it with a positive thought, and you do this repetitiously, or I don't know if that's the word. You do it repetitively, and you do it over and over and over, and you start to see a snowball effect that's positive. If you have that snowball effect that's negative, you're going to have the positive effect as well, which is wonderful. That's great. So all or none thinking is you think about yourself or the world in black and white. All or none categories. All or nothing categories. Shades of gray do not exist. So a lot of this is it's not about morality. I know that with morality, some of it is black and white, but this is more like situations in your life, for example. And some morality is gray too, I would argue, but not all of it. A lot of it obviously is not. There's right and there's wrong. So I'm not saying this is true across the board, but you have to look at the context of it, right? So all or none thinking is the first cognitive distortion, and it says when you fail, you may tell yourself you're a complete failure. So an example would be, let's say that you go for a job interview and you really had a lot of hope and you put yourself into it and you don't get the job. And you're like, I'm a screw up. I'm a failure. They didn't like me. I'm not good at this. I'm never going to get a job. So that's all or none thinking. And I've had a lot of struggles with that myself, and I understand. But a positive distortion, when you succeed, you may tell yourself that you're a winner and feel superior. I think that's kind of cheesy. That response is a little cheesy. But I would say something like, you think about the fact, you say, there was a lot of people interviewing for that job, and, I worked really hard, and I'm proud of myself for putting myself into that so fully. I'm disappointed I didn't get the job, but that's not a reflection of me. I'll do better next time, and we'll get a good job. Maybe there's a better one in store for me. So you see how you can be optimistic and realistic at the same time? So I like to put a little bit of dose of reality in it instead of being like really cheesy and being like, I'm a winner. If you want to say that, that's great. But I just like to think about it in terms of being positive and reminding yourself that if you don't get a job, it doesn't define who you are, and it doesn't mean you're incompetent. It doesn't really mean anything about you, really. So number 2 is overgeneralization. Overgeneralization. And it says you think about a negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat, or a positive event as as an overall never-ending pattern of success. So an example would be when you're rejected by someone you care about, you may tell yourself that you're an unlovable loser who will be alone and miserable forever. I've struggled with this one because there's a couple of people in my life that I love very much, and I know they love me, but it sometimes feels like they don't have a lot of time for me. And they're very busy, and I understand that, and I try to always be understanding, but it feels like sometimes you're always the back burner person, And so that can make you think, well, maybe they hate me, and I'm not a good person, and I'm unlovable, and there's something about me that they don't want to be around, and this is going to go on forever, right? So you take one event, or even a few events, and you make it the absolute for everything for all time, okay? And so ways to counter that, it says, is when you overcome an episode of depression or self-doubt and you're suddenly feeling happy again, you may tell yourself that all your problems are solved and that you'll always feel happy. So the cognitive distortions aren't just like negative. Like when you're depressed, you might say, I'm always going to feel this way. For example, right now, I'll be honest, I don't deal with summer and heat very well, and it's been hot this summer. And on top of that, I have this medical condition, I think it's my vagus nerve, where I get these hot flushes, and I'll just feel hot for hours on end. And there are certain things that help, and I'm starting to get better after having an episode of this. But when you combine those two things and then combine that with anxiety and higher anxiety in the summer, when you look at the weather forecasting, you see 95, 98, and sunny, clouds bring relief, right? I start to feel like it's going to be this way forever, and because all you can see in the weather report is that it's July, so you're going to see it as far out as there is. But if I remind myself that this isn't forever, it's not, and it's overgeneralizing, and it's just, okay, this is a pattern that's going to go on for a couple of weeks, but there will be other patterns as the summer goes on. It'll change, and then fall will get here, and the weather overall will cool down. It will happen. It might not be perfect fall weather, but it will cool down. So there are those elements of overgeneralization. And so thinking about it from both sides, you don't want to overemphasize the other way. You want to keep a good grip on objective reality, okay? Leaning towards the positive. So if you have depression, you're not going to be depressed forever. And if you are happy, you're not going to be happy forever. Moods change like clouds in the sky. And that's why there needs to be a stability that we find in Christ, that we find in doing the healing work. Okay. So the number 3 of the cognitive distortions is mental filter. mental filter. And it says you think exclusively about your shortcomings and ignore your positive qualities and accomplishments, or you dwell on the positives and overlook the negatives. So guess what? We've talked about toxic positivity and bypassing on this channel a lot. That's a cognitive distortion. Okay, leaning towards optimism, choosing to be optimistic when you don't know what's going on is not a cognitive distortion. But when you choose to only see the positives and not even consider the big picture, that's also not good either. And so that's why I hate that half glass full and glass half empty metaphor. It's an oversimplification. The glass is half empty and half full. That's the reality. Here's an example of mental filtering. A TV talk show host, it says, told me that he typically received hundreds of enthusiastic emails from fans every day, but there was nearly always one critical email from a disgruntled viewer. He explained that he'd obsess for hours about the negative email and completely overlooked the hundreds of glowing ones. As a result, he constantly struggled with feelings of anxiety and self-esteem in spite of his tremendous ratings and popularity. You probably understand that if you dealt with a lot of emotional neglect or mental abuse as a child, emotional abuse. For example, I know I can do this. If you have a job evaluation and you have like 10 glowing positive things and then one thing that you can work on, which one do you tend to focus on? The one that you need to work on. And that obsession just gets snowballs, right? I'm sure you understand what I'm saying if you've had mental filter. So a way that you can work on that is to pull back from that obsession. Focus on all the things you did good and keep telling yourself those things. You keep telling yourself that, I'm doing really good. There's one thing I can work on. That's okay. I'm human. Everybody, when they get a job evaluation, almost everybody, there's something they can work on, no matter how good they are. You're human. You're not perfect. And that's okay. And then maybe step away from it a little while and then come back to it and look at it objectively. That's what I tell my students in the writing course when they're getting feedback on their writing, because that's a very emotional and personal process. So the positive distortion example is you may fantasize about how good that dessert will taste and ignore the negative, like gaining weight and feeling guilty or bloated afterwards. Or you may tell yourself how great you feel if you have a drink and ignore the fact that you nearly always drink too much and end up with a hangover. So that's a positive distortion that can actually be unhealthy there. So what I've realized going through these is that this chart is giving examples of positive and negative distortions. And so I'm just kind of adding a little bit to these to show you how you can counter them, because that's kind of the whole point here. So when you have a distortion of discounting the facts, that's number 4. Discounting the facts. You tell yourself that negative or positive facts don't count so as to maintain a universally negative or positive self-image. So you're not looking at the whole picture. Discounting facts. Discounting the positive might be when someone genuinely compliments you. When someone genuinely compliments you, you may tell yourself they're only saying that to make you feel good. You can't possibly have those qualities that they mentioned that are so great, right? So discounting the positive is when you distort. It's almost like the opposite of the mental filter. Somebody points out something good, and that's the central thing, and then you have to poke holes in it, right? So discounting the negative, this is where bypassing can happen. I'm not saying dwell on the negative, but being aware of the big picture and the whole situation is accurate. So when you're trying to diet and feeling tempted by something tasty, you may tell yourself, I'll only have one little bite, but you're probably giving yourself the message hundreds of occasions, and it has never once been accurate. So discounting the negative is when you know you have a propensity for something and you deny it. Denial could be a form of discounting the positive or the negative. It's a form of denial, and we talk about it on this channel. Denial is more than a river in Egypt, right? So during an argument, you may get defensive and insist that the other person is, quote, wrong. Then the conflict escalates. So it could be that somebody may point something out and they're not being ugly or rude, and you're like, no, that's not true. That's not true. Narcissists? Sound familiar? If you tell them that all these things, they'll deny things that are so obvious, that have concrete proof. It's insane. how many cognitive distortions narcissists have. The thing is unfortunately somebody who's a true full-blown narcissist, not everybody with narcissistic tendencies is this way, but a full-blown sociopath or narcissist is not capable of correcting these cognitive distortions on a genuine level. That's the sad thing, because they can't self-evaluate. It requires empathy and it requires a conscience to do that. And I can't judge who has a conscience and who doesn't, but that's part of narcissism. Number 5 is jumping to conclusions. You jump to conclusions that aren't warranted by facts. There are 2 common forms. Mind reading is a form of jumping to conclusions where you make assumptions about how other people are thinking and feeling. And fortune telling, you make dogmatic, negative, or positive predictions about the future. So jumping to conclusions is assuming that something is happening that may not be happening. So a negative example of mind reading is if you're feeling shy at a party, you may tell yourself that other people don't have to struggle with shyness or that they'd look down on you if they knew you were shy. You don't know that. That's reading their mind. You'd be surprised how many people probably actually feel the same way as you. And that's why I don't think commiserating is healthy, all the time. But I think that when you can share common struggles with other people, it helps to make you feel like you're not alone, and there's a reason for that, because you know that there's nothing wrong with you, that it's a universal experience that everybody has. Fortune telling is the other one, and a negative distortion of that is when you're depressed, you may tell yourself that you'll never recover, and when you're feeling anxious, you may tell yourself that something terrible is going to happen. Like when I give my talk, my mind will go blank, I'll look like an idiot. You're predicting the future when it's not even here yet and you don't even know what it is. And that's what most anxiety is about. Even the Bible talks about, do not be anxious about your life, for the future has enough worry of its own. Easier said than done, right? But that's why we talk about how to deal with anxiety, how to deal with those thoughts, how to deal with those feelings. It's one thing to tell you to do it, but how? And that's what this podcast is all about, right? And then mind reading a positive distortion, you may tell yourself that a relationship is going really well when the other person is actually feeling annoyed or unhappy with you. Maybe somebody smiles at you. Well, I'm not saying you, but if somebody just sees somebody smile at somebody and they think they're flirting, that's an example of a positive distortion. Just because somebody smiles at you doesn't mean they're flirting. But there are people that think that. Ick. Fortune telling, you may tell yourself, I'll just have one drink, one bite, and when in fact you never stop at just one drink or bite. It sounds a lot like the other distortion. I think it's good to be optimistic about the future. And I even believe in being a little biased towards the positive, okay? But being delusional, there's something called magical thinking. And that's like if you have an issue or a situation, maybe you've got a relationship and it's problematic and you do nothing about it and you're like, well, everything will be all right. It'll work out okay. But you don't do anything to take inventory of your thoughts or to talk to that person. That's fortune telling, positive distortion fortune telling, because you're assuming everything's going to work out when you're not doing anything to work on it when you've got red flags. Okay, so ignoring red flags could be an example of positive fortune telling. Number 6, magnification and minimization. You blow things out of proportion or shrink their importance inappropriately. This is also called the binocular trick, because it's looking through the ends of a pair of binoculars. You know how you look at the long end and it's like, whoop, and you look at the close end and it's like, whoop, closer. So things either look much bigger or much smaller than they are in reality. Kind of like your rearview mirror, right? So when you're procrastinating, a negative distortion would be you may think about everything that you've been putting off and tell yourself how overwhelming those tasks can be. That's magnification, because you're taking a few things you need to do and making them everything. We all do that. I'm very bad about doing that. I struggle with that still. I get overwhelmed easily. And that's why I have to keep my workload manageable, because that's how I am. And then that's magnification. Minimization, negative, is you may also tell yourself that your efforts today wouldn't amount to anything anyway, so you might as well put it off. That's minimizing what you can get done. So let's say you've got to mow your lawn, trim the hedges, and you need to paint a bedroom. And you're like, I can't do all that. That's just too much. So you're like, I'm just not going to do anything. Instead of saying, okay, well, today I'll mow the lawn. Sunday, I will trim the hedges, and next weekend, I will paint the bedroom. And that's more realistic, right? So, also, magnification and minimization, positive distortions. When you're trying to diet, I don't know why they keep talking about diet, But anyway, when you're trying to diet, you tell yourself, this ice cream will taste so good. Magnification. Is it really worth it? That's the question, right? Will it really be that good? Will it be worth the way you'll feel about it with yourself after you give in to the urge or binge? So positive minimization or maximization might be like you're in love with somebody and you're blinded by any flaws they have because you're in that phase of just the first part, right? And you're just like, oh, they're so great and they're so wonderful. They're just perfect in every way. And I'm so in love. And it may not be that there's a genuine connection there and they are a good person. But the danger of that is like hoovering and love bombing with narcissists, empaths, and people that are prone to codependency need to be especially careful about minimization and magnification positive with narcissists because it blinds us. We only see the good and it's all just so wonderful and we don't even see the other stuff. So number 7 is emotional reasoning. You reason from how you feel. I do that a lot. If you are in the, if you've heard of the Myers-Briggs test, they're feelers, and I am very much a feeler versus a thinker. I tend to go off of my emotions more instead of logic, and most of us tend towards one or the other. And so people like me and people that are more emotionally based have to be really careful about this. You reason from how you feel. In point of fact, your feelings result from your thoughts and not from what is actually happening. If your thoughts are distorted, your feelings will be as misleading as the grotesque images you see in your curved funhouse mirrors. So you can actually deceive yourself by going off of your emotions only. You need to listen to your emotions, but you need to also use reasoning and logic and objective reality. And that's where the cognitive distortions give you a frame of reference, an anchor, a center point, right? So you can attest. Even the Bible says test the spirits. This is testing so that your emotions don't run away with you and deceive you, because emotions can deceive you in some cases. And, a lot of Christian groups and organizations emphasize that a lot. And I understand that. And there's truth to that. But it doesn't mean you ignore your emotions. And it doesn't mean your emotions never have anything to tell you. It's just that you need to focus on looking at the big picture and using logic and objective reality with your emotions. Okay. It doesn't mean suppressing your emotions. It means working all of this in tandem together. Okay. So a type of emotional reasoning that's a negative distortion, you may tell yourself, I'll clean my desk or start my diet when I'm more in the mood. I just don't feel like it right now. Of course, the feeling never comes, usually doesn't. So sometimes do you need to do things when you don't feel like it? You're darn straight you do. It's tough, it's hard, but that's what the healing work is. You rarely feel like doing it. It's like working out. You have to discipline yourself to do it. It's tough. But the more you do that, every time you make that habit and you work on that cognitive distortion, you create another thread in the rope. And as you continue to build that habit, the rope gets thicker until it becomes more second nature and it gets easier over time. Another example, when you're depressed, you may tell yourself, I feel like a loser, so I must really be one. Or I feel hopeless, so I must be hopeless. That's where you're taking an emotion and making it the reality. When it's a feeling, there's a saying, don't always trust what you're thinking, or think about what you're thinking, question what you're thinking. Just because you feel something doesn't make it absolute. Just because you think something doesn't make it absolute. Remember that feelings and thoughts are like clouds in the sky. They pass, they change, they're temporary. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways, especially if they're negative. Positive distortion, when you're gambling, you may say, I feel lucky. I just know I'm about to hit the jackpot. And the next thing you know, your bank account's empty. That's an example of where an addictive behavior, positive distortion of emotional reasoning going on your feelings can cause a lot of problems. This distortion also triggers romantic intoxication, where you get caught up with the narcissist. This is the emotional element of it, where I'm not saying that if you're in that place that you're in a distorted or unhealthy relationship. That's not what I'm saying. But with a narcissist, that's likely to happen because they hoover and they love bomb, which means they're just like, oh, you're so great. Oh, I totally understand you. Oh, I experienced that too. And they're lying right through their teeth, So, but when you meet someone attractive or someone that you feel like you connect with, and even those powerful connections are sometimes real, it's just a matter of keeping your eyes open and being objective. But you may feel so happy and so excited you think he or she must be wonderful, that man or that woman of your dreams. Okay? So it's basically getting swept away with your emotions and not looking at the big picture and using reason as well. Should statements is number 8. Should statements. Oh gosh, I struggle with this one a lot. And I've recently dealt with that. I dealt with some crushing guilt because I was helping somebody and they were becoming demanding and unreasonable and they were crossing boundaries, and I backed off one time and they kept on and on and on and on and on. And I had to cut that relationship off. And I felt so bad because this person did need help. But it was triggering my PTSD, and there was no boundaries. And even when I would put up a boundary, they would find a way around it and try to exploit my goodwill. And I finally said, no, I can't do that anymore. I have to stop. But I felt crushing guilt for it. Crushing guilt. Oh, I should help this person. How can I abandon them? Things like that. And I had done what I could do for them, and to the best of my ability based on my health as well, and I just couldn't do it anymore, and there were no boundaries even when I set them that were respected, so I had to stop. Okay? Should statements, though, you make yourself or others miserable with shoulds, musts, and ought tos. Another one that I say is connected to this is fog. Fear, obligation, and guilt. And there's a good book by Dana Morningstar called Fog. I forgot the full name of it, but I will put that in the show notes as well. Dana Morningstar wrote it, and it's called Fear, Obligation, and Guilt. If you struggle with that, get that book. If you struggle with should statements, because you need to work on that. If you're going to do something for somebody, it shouldn't be because you feel guilty and compulsive and you'll hate yourself if you don't, and you're a terrible person if you don't. It should be about that person and about wanting to help them and coming from a genuine place and coming from, you cannot give water from a well that's empty or dry. Okay? So that's where coming from a genuine place, God loves a cheerful giver, all of that comes into play. It's healthy to want to do it from your heart, to do it because you love God and you love people, not because you're feeling obligated and you're scared to say no. Okay? So 3 types of should statements: self-directed shoulds. Cause feelings of guilt, shame, depression, and worthlessness. Other directed shoulds cause feelings of anger and trigger interpersonal conflict. World-directed shoulds cause feelings of frustration and entitlement. Hidden shoulds are implied by negative thoughts. So, negative distortions, self-directed shoulds, you tell yourself that you shouldn't have screwed up and made such a stupid mistake. Other directed shoulds, you may tell yourself that fellow shouldn't have cut me off in front of traffic like that. I'll show him that he can't get away with that. And world-directed shoulds, the train shouldn't be late when I'm in such a hurry. We've all done these. We've all had these. So the other directed shoulds, I've worked on that one and made a lot of improvements. And I used to be like, well, that shouldn't happen. That should happen. And I still get that way sometimes. But if you're a very justice-oriented person like I am, then that's a really hard one to overcome. But there's a certain piece that comes with accepting things as they are instead of as they should be. And if you're just like, well, that's what happened, and you're just like, okay, that is healthier than the shoulds, right? And I'm a justice-oriented person because I'm an INFJ. That's my Myers-Briggs personality. And those are literally the activists, the advocates. And so that makes us more oriented towards the shoulds. A lot more. So, positive distortions of self-directed shoulds be when you're feeling tempted, you may tell yourself, I had a hard day, I deserve a drink or a nice dish of ice cream. This thing keeps talking about diets. Having a drink or having some ice cream isn't going to hurt you. But if you do it every day, that's the different story. Other directed shoulds, you may tell yourself that your values are the best values and that other people should think and feel the same way. Oh my Lord, do we have a problem in our country with that right now? And it's happening on both sides. Both sides are guilty, and that's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to leave it there. I think it's all distorted, and I think people need to come back to finding some kind of middle ground and stop thinking they're right about everything, because you start to dehumanize the other side. You can think whatever you want. You can be on whatever side you want, but you've got to remember that the people on the other side are human, even if you are disgusted by their views. Okay? You're entitled to have points of view of your own, but just remember that any of us could be wrong at any point in time. Any of us. And we need to keep some humility, and we need to keep an open mind. I'll just leave it there. Sorry, that's my INFJ coming through again. World-directed shoulds. You may tell yourself the world should be the way you expect it to be. There's a line in a Billy Joel song. It's some people hope for a miracle cure. Some people just accept the world as it is. I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, but that is definitely goes with this distortion. Labeling is number 9. We just have 2 more. Labeling is number 9. You label yourself or others instead. Instead of what? I'm not sure. But labeling is basically just slapping a label on yourself or somebody else because of some single situation or a couple of situations that happen. Labeling is actually an extreme form of overgeneralization because you see your entire self or essence as defective and globally bad or superior. That goes with what I said before. If you can start to dehumanize the opposition, well, they're wrong, they're stupid, they're idiotic. That is labeling. Okay? If you say, I'm wrong, I'm stupid, I'm idiotic, that's labeling yourself. So a negative distortion, you may label yourself as someone you're not getting along with. You might label yourself or someone you're not getting along with as a loser or a jerk. A physician slipped up on her diet and gave in to the temptation to eat a donut. Then she told herself that she was a big fat pig with no willpower. You ate a donut. Move on. Just remember tomorrow you're not going to have a donut. You'll have carrots instead. That kind of thing, The thought was so upsetting that she ate 6 more donuts. Okay, well, if you screw up, you screwed up. Okay, that's okay. Then don't eat the other 6 donuts. Just stop right there and be like, okay, that was a nice donut. I'm not going to do that again for a couple of days. All right? Self-directed shoulds, when you're feeling tempted, this is the positive distortion. You may tell yourself, I've had a hard day. I deserve a drink or a nice dish of ice cream. I swear I just read that one. Anyway, positive shoulds might be, well, somebody should do this for me. It might be an entitlement thing, and it might be based on an individual relationship, or it might be something larger. Well, because I'm a good person, this should happen to me. I struggle with that one because there's a lot of things I thought God had told me and promised me, especially financially. And not only did it happen, but things fell through and went the opposite way of what I thought. And that has affected my relationship with God in so many ways because it wasn't just that it didn't work out. It actually went the opposite way. And that was like the one thing that I thought God had promised me. I struggled, and I'll admit that I'm still struggling in this area, but it's good to be reminded that these are thought distortions. It's not just that simple. It's not always just a thought distortion. It's connected to something more complicated. And so I have to ask God to help me with that. And I know God's not going to help me understand. I could pray for God to help me understand why, but I'm not going to get a why. And so I'm kind of floating right now with this world-directed, other-directed should in my own life. So just note that sometimes you can struggle with these for a long time, but I'm not giving up on finding some peace in that area of my life. And that does not mean that things won't work out in that area of my life as well. Just because they haven't doesn't mean they won't, right? So think about that for yourself as well, all right? Labeling. I went back over to the should statements when I was talking about that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. But when you do well, you think of yourself as a winner. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but you don't want to get carried away with that. You want to keep some humility and some open mind there to learn something. Motivational speakers, politicians, athletic coaches often use this strategy to motivate people. I think of Tony Robbins. I have nothing against Tony Robbins. I'm not bashing him. I actually still have a couple of his books from back in the day, but they didn't work for me. I know that he's helped a lot of people, but it's just oversimplification. In reality, there's no such thing as a winner or a loser. We're all humans, and no one can win or lose all the time, right? That is true. If you think about it, nobody wins or loses all the time, okay? Number 10, the last distortion, last one. You find fault with everyone. Blame. You find fault with yourself, self-blame, or others, other blame, okay? Now, sometimes blame may be accurate. Okay, so it's not always a distortion, but it's also how you deal with it. For example, if you had a narcissistic mother who was controlling and demeaning and constantly micromanaged your weight and your looks, and now you have an eating disorder because of it, and you blame her, she is the reason for that. But getting caught up in that blame can cause harm to you. That's why this is a cognitive distortion. Plus, there are times people blame, or they're so blame oriented that they can't just let something go. That's a minor thing. I'm not talking about the eating disorder thing. That's genuinely, hurtful. But like, maybe something happens and somebody's caught in the middle of something and they didn't do it on purpose, and you're just blame, instead of being like, okay, I understand they couldn't help that. And you kind of show some grace and show some mercy. There's a balance between setting boundaries and not letting people run over you, and showing some people some mercy and some leeway, right? I try to do that. I struggled with that a long time, and I'm just now finding some kind of equilibrium there. But self-blame is if you're depressed, you may beat on yourself constantly. Done that. And mercilessly, blaming yourself for every error and shortcoming instead of using energy to find creative solutions to your problems. So it's just, putting something on yourself that is not your fault. If you're depressed, in very few cases, it might be your fault, something that you could prevent and something that was just stupid on your part. But most of the time, 9 times out of 10, if you're depressed, it's not your fault. Taking responsibility for your thoughts and actions is not the same thing as blaming yourself. That's another distinction to understand. Other blame. During an argument, you may tell yourself that the other person is to blame for the conflict. Then you feel like an innocent victim and overlook your own role in the problem. That's in a healthy, balanced relationship, or a relationship where there are some functional components and maybe it's a little problematic. When you're dealing with an outright abuser, there are cases where you're the victim and they're wrong, period. But that's why you have to look at it objectively, observe, feel, listen to your emotions, feel them, but don't get caught up in them. Use objective reality and use logic. Okay? So those are the 10 cognitive distortions. I know it took a while to go through them, but I wanted you to know what they are. And let me just go through all of them real quick again. All or none thinking, overgeneralization, mental filter, discounting the facts, jumping to conclusions, magnification and minimization, emotional reasoning, should statements, labeling, and blame. Those are the 10 cognitive distortions. So ask yourself, do you have any of those? Think about these in context. Think about how you balance your emotions, feeling those, and being aware of reality, including some negatives. That doesn't mean you roll around in them or dwell on them. And leaning towards maybe a slight positive bias while also being realistic. I think that's where the right focus is. That's just my opinion, but I think that's where the right focus is. So how do you change these distortions? How do you work on them? Well, like I said, I will put the Feeling Good book link in the show notes, and the Feeling Good handbook. That's by Burns. I can't remember his first name, but he's been around for a long, long time. That's old stuff. It's classic. It's been updated and all that. But the Healthline article, I wanted to read a little bit about, and this is the last part we're going to go through today, but I wanted to go through how do you overcome these. So we talked about ways to counter them when you're going through the process. I would encourage picking up those books or find another book on cognitive distortions and just going through it and practicing. That's the best thing you can do. Keep a journal, practice, go through a book, write down and follow the practices that they show you. Keep account of your thoughts. I mean, you can't do it all the time. It'll make you crazy. But just observing your thoughts a little bit each day and writing them down and countering them and then rethinking that thought. Maybe you focus on one cognitive distortion at a time. Which one do you struggle with the most? And you say, okay, I'm just going to focus on this one cognitive distortion for this month. For July, I'm going to focus on all or none thinking. And focus it based on not some arbitrary thing, but on what you need. Focus on what you need, So the Healthline article, how can you change the cognitive distortions? It says The good news is that cognitive distortions can be corrected over time. Here are some steps you can take if you want to change thought patterns that may not be helpful. Identify the troublesome thought is the first one. When you realize a thought is causing anxiety or dampening your mood, a good first step is to figure out what kind of distorted thinking is taking place. So identify what the thought is and what kind of distortion it is, or the closest thing. And in some cases, it may be a couple, but try to keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate this. Don't overthink it. Find the one distortion it is, and then you can switch that thought either way. And if it's a little bit of both, then just pick one and then just go with that. Okay? To better understand how your thoughts affect your emotions and behaviors, you may want to consider reading Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy by clinical psychologist Dr. David Burns. Thank you, Helpline. That helped me remember the full book name. It's on my shelf over here, but I forgot what it was called. But this book is considered by many the definitive work on the subject. I would call it the, forgive my term here, but the Bible on cognitive distortions. It literally is. The next one, number 2, try reframing the situation. Remember flipping the script? There was a podcast episode a couple of years ago on flipping the script, the narrative of your life. Look for shades of gray, alternative explanations, objective evidence, and positive interpretations to expand your thinking. You might find it helpful to write down your original thought, followed by 3 or 4 alternative interpretations. And that's where you can sit down for 10 minutes a day. And if you don't have time to go through this every day, all day, just doing that can be helpful. If you can do it on a more thorough level, that's great. Some people even have like a rubber band around their wrist, and if they think a negative thought, they'll pop it. I don't know if I want to do that, but if it works for you and it doesn't re-traumatize you, go for it. But I would argue for most people, it would probably re-traumatize you. So, probably not a good idea. Perform a cost-benefit analysis is number 3. People usually repeat behaviors that deliver some benefit. There is psychology that proves that every action we take and every choice we make is either the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. That's evolution, okay? So you repeat behaviors that have benefit. You might find it helpful to analyze how your thought patterns have helped you cope with the past. There are reasons you think the way you do. Does it give you some kind of advantage? Even if it's not good for you, there can be advantages. If you can deconstruct that and get to the root of that and take away that source, then you can start to overcome some of these at the root. Do they give you a sense of control in situations where you feel powerless? Find a substitute. Deal with your emotions that are underneath that. And then you're dealing with a thought and a feeling at the same time. You're doing somatic and cognitive work at the same time. And boom, you've gotten rid of and healed that particular issue. That one little part of that one issue for that day. Do they allow you to avoid taking responsibility or taking necessary risks? Maybe there's some fear there and you're trying to avoid the fear. That's why getting underneath our emotions, feeling our emotions and not avoiding them is so vital. But it says you can also ask yourself what engaging in cognitive distortions costs you. What are they costing you? Weighing the pros and cons of your thought patterns could motivate you to change them. You might even do like a pro-con list. Pros on one side, cons on the other. List, and then see what comes out. Another one is consider cognitive behavioral therapy. Will it completely heal your trauma? Probably not. Will it help you heal in conjunction with other treatments and therapies? Yes, it will. CBT is widely recognized a form of talk therapy in which people learn to identify, interrupt, and change unhealthy thinking patterns. If you'd like some guidance on identifying and changing distorted thinking, you might find this type of therapy useful. So working with a therapist on these, most CBT therapists know cognitive distortions and can work with you on them. So working with a therapist, doing the journaling, meditating, and going through workbooks and regular books and courses are ways that you can work on this in a concrete way, whatever you have the resources to do. You can do a lot of this for very cheap or free. You could get the book and then go through the book, okay? It takes you methodically through the thought processes and how to counter them and all of that stuff, thought by thought. But it says CBT usually focuses on specific goals. It generally takes place for a predetermined number of sessions and may take a few weeks to a few months to see results. And then it talks about therapists. The bottom line, it says, is cognitive distortions are habitual ways of thinking that are often inaccurate and negatively biased. Cognitive distortions usually develop over time in response to adverse events or trauma. Researchers have identified at least 10 common distorted thinking patterns. If you're ready to tackle cognitive distortions, you may want to try some of the methods found in the cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, and also try the Burns books as well. This type of therapy has been successful in helping people identify cognitive distortions and retrain themselves to look at the world in a clearer, more rational, and I would also argue more optimistic way. Okay, so that's why I wanted to go over cognitive distortions, because if you're aware of your thinking, not to the point that you're neurotic about it, but if you're aware of your thinking, you start changing some of those. Even if you just stop a thought in its tracks, you don't necessarily counter it, and then you distract yourself and move on to something else. That's a good thing. Okay, that's a good thing. So we've talked about cognitive distortions, what they are, how that can contribute to the trauma cycle. We've talked about the 10 cognitive distortions and how they can manifest. We've talked about ways to counter those. We've talked about how cognitive distortions and healing those and working on those is actually scriptural. And we've also talked about some methods and resources that you can use to help counter cognitive distortions and to change your thinking over time. It's about daily practice, a little bit at a time, adds up over time, and it's about doing the reprogramming, healing work of your mind in conjunction and in tandem with the somatic healing work of your body. Okay? So I will put all those resources in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to check out the Ko-Fi and Patreon if you want to contribute. Thank you so much for those who have. Check out the YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe bell. I'll put all those links in the show notes. Also, go check out the Facebook group, also linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's one day at a time, and it gets better and better and better. And sometimes you take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but overall you're moving forward. So keep going. You will see the results of your work. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. This is season 3, episode 13, Rethinking Our Thoughts, part 1, what are cognitive distortions and how can I overcome them? And we'll do part 2 next time, which is Rethinking Our Thoughts, what is learned helplessness and how can I overcome them? Thank you so much for listening. God bless you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.